Barcelona, 1909. A city on the brink of implosion. The streets pulsed with fury as the tragic week erupted. A violent revolt that tore through the heart of the city, fueled by anger at a government and church seen as corrupt and indifferent. Smoke curled into the sky like black veins, rising from smouldering churches and shattered storefronts. Holy sanctuaries became battlegrounds. Ash drifted down like snow. The alleys of the Raval district echoed with the sharp crack of rifles and the desperate cries of those caught in the chaos. In the shadows of this crumbling world stood a woman, a wisp of a figure draped in black. Her dress clung to her like soot, her face hidden beneath a shawl, save for her eyes, cold, piercing and unblinking. She watched as barefoot children clawed through heaps of garbage for scraps of food. She moved toward one of them, quiet, deliberate. Her hand reached out, gentle, almost affectionate. The child saw her and bolted. A flicker of a smile crossed her lips. Then, like smoke, she vanished. Her name was Enriqueta Marti, but history would come to know her by another name, the Vampire of Barcelona. She hadn't always been a phantom of the slums. Born in Sant Feliu de Llobregat in 1868, Enriqueta entered a world already hardened against her. Her family belonged to Spain's struggling rural class, barely surviving on patchy farming work and menial labour. Childhood for Enriqueta wasn't something you remembered fondly, it was something you survived. Spain at the time was unravelling. Wars, disease, and hunger swept through the country like wildfire. Education was a luxury few could afford, and affection even more rare. For girls like Enriqueta, survival meant growing up fast and trusting no one. By the time she reached her teens, Barcelona shimmered in the distance like a promise. Its grand avenues and factory chimneys called to her with dreams of a better life. But beneath the city's glamour hid another reality, one of soot, sweat, and streets lined with desperation. She arrived in Barcelona alone, clinging to hope. At first, she did what many young women from the countryside did, took work in middle-class homes, scrubbing floors and serving meals. But domestic work in the city was often just another form of servitude. Maids were easily exploited, discarded, and rarely respected. Enriqueta was no exception. Her quiet demeanour and small frame likely made her an easy target. Soon, the glittering hope of the city began to fade. Barcelona wasn't a haven, it was a trap, especially for women. The Raval district, with its twisting alleys and murky underworld, welcomed the forgotten. Over time, Enriqueta slipped further from the world of daylight. By the late 1880s, she was on the margins, where women bartered not just their labour, but their bodies and their identities to survive. Then came a brief pause in the storm: marriage. In 1895, Enriqueta wed Juan Pujalo, a painter with little fame, but perhaps a little charm. For a fleeting moment, it seemed life might offer her some peace. But Juan couldn't accept the secrets she carried. Her life, her choices, her struggles, they were too tangled for him. The marriage unravelled again and again until one day it shattered entirely. In 1905, their infant son Alejandro died. He was not yet a year old. Starvation claimed him, a slow, merciless end far too common in the overcrowded, impoverished corners of Raval. Researchers believe this loss marked a breaking point for Enriqueta. Something inside her cracked, maybe from grief, maybe guilt. Or maybe something darker had always lived there, waiting for the right moment to surface. Years later, she was arrested for luring a little girl, Teresita Guitart, from the street. When authorities searched Enriqueta's apartment, what they discovered horrified the nation. Belongings believed to have come from missing children, a list of names in a notebook, and whispers of rituals that sounded more medieval than modern. The rumours came fast and frenzied. Enriqueta, they said, was no ordinary woman. She was a practitioner of dark arts, a supplier of ancient elixirs made from the innocent, and her clientele? Not fellow outcasts, but Barcelona's elite. She became a monster in the public's imagination, a predator in human skin, a witch in the heart of a rotting city. But was it all true? The Barcelona of her time was a city sick with secrets. The tragic week laid bare a system riddled with injustice, where the poor were voiceless and the powerful untouchable. Amid this chaos, Enriqueta became more than a person. She became a symbol, a scapegoat, a convenient vessel for society's guilt, fear, and fury. She had lost everything: her child, her marriage, her place in the world. Was she truly the monster they made her out to be? Or was she a broken woman swallowed by a system that needed a villain to hide its own sins? History remembers her as a villain, but legends, especially dark ones, often tell more about the world that creates them than the people they portray. And Enriqueta Marti's story, it's not just a horror tale. It's a reflection of a city in collapse, and the woman who, whether truly guilty or tragically damned, became its most terrifying mirror. To truly understand what Enriqueta became, you first have to understand what Barcelona was. A city fractured by class and soaked in contradiction. The poor lined up at church doors for scraps while the elite toasted wine in glittering salons. In that world, a woman in mourning, draped in black, could be seen as a saint or something far darker. They said she always kept a pair of tiny shoes on her table, her dead son's. They were worn, with faded stitching, resting beside her herbs like a memory frozen in time. Some believed it was grief, others whispered it was something else, that she had turned her heartbreak into a purpose, a dangerous one. It started small. Around 1905, Enriqueta offered herbal cures, concoctions made from roots and leaves, to women who had nowhere else to turn. Poor women, forgotten women. They came for remedies to ease their pain, infertility, bleeding, infections. And in the shadows of a healthcare system that treated the poor like afterthoughts, Enriqueta's cures were trusted, not because they were proven, but because they were all that was left. Word spread. People began calling her La Curandera, the one who could fix what others couldn't. She became a quiet fixture in the neighborhood, not beloved exactly, but relied on. And then she began to drift into other circles, darker corners. She started mingling with the ones society liked to pretend didn't exist. Black market hustlers, brothel owners, street women clinging to survival. And as her world expanded into Barcelona's grimiest folds, so did the rumors. Was she still a healer, or had she become something else entirely? You see, in Raval, the line between healing and surviving blurred quickly, and Enriqueta never made a fuss. She moved like smoke between neighborhoods, modestly dressed, soft-spoken, but people began to notice that her modesty was a mask, a carefully kept one. She was no longer just a figure of comfort. Whispers began to follow her, whispers about strange ingredients, rituals and cures that couldn't be explained. Beliefs in life-giving elixirs weren't unheard of in folk traditions, and in a time when death waited at every corner, people clung to anything that might keep it at bay. Even if that meant blood, even if that meant children. It's disturbing. But maybe in her own warped way, Enriqueta believed she was helping. Perhaps in her broken heart, still grieving for her lost son, she thought she was saving others by sacrificing a few. That doesn't make her innocent, but it might make her human. Slowly, the way people looked at her began to change. Where once she'd been seen as a quiet helper, she became a source of dread. Mothers who once sought her aid now kept their children close when she passed. The warmth she once carried seemed to flicker out, that replaced by a kind of silence that made people nervous. That's when the disappearances began. Children, the familiar street kids who once roamed freely, began vanishing. No explanations, no answers, just gone. And in a place already soaked in fear, that silence screamed. People started watching her differently. Her black shawl, once a symbol of mourning, now felt like a cloak of secrets. Her home, always quiet, suddenly seemed too quiet. She wasn't starving like the rest. Her dresses were always pressed, her shoes intact. She returned from the market with baskets full of food that others couldn't afford. People began asking, how? How was she surviving when the rest of them were barely scraping by? Rumors twisted tighter. Some said she wasn't just selling herbs anymore, that her real clients lived in the grand houses of Passeig de Gracia, that she brewed potions for the rich, secret tonics for youth, beauty and energy. Potions made with things no one dared name out loud. A few claimed they saw notebooks in her home, pages filled with cryptic formulas and names. Names no one recognized from Raval. Names that didn't belong. Those notebooks, if they existed, became legendary. A hidden ledger of something foul, a whisper of betrayal, a record of secrets the city didn't want uncovered. Still, no one confronted her. She kept her head low, her eyes sharp, and when she passed through the alleys, no one spoke. The children stopped playing. The women turned away. Raval was a place of shouting, of life even in hardship, but around her there was only stillness. And in that stillness, people started to believe they were looking not at a neighbour but at a ghost, a creature walking the border between the living and the damned. By the time 1912 approached, Enriqueta Marti was no longer seen as a healer or a grieving mother or even a poor woman trying to survive. She had become a symbol, a question no one wanted answered, the embodiment of everything Barcelona tried to hide. Barcelona, 1912. The winter air bit through stone walls and curled like smoke through the city's narrow streets. Beneath the fog, something was stirring, something that would soon unravel one of the most chilling cases in Spanish history. It began with a child. A little girl named Teresita Guitart Congost, 5 years old, blonde curls, bright eyes. She had vanished one afternoon while playing near her grandmother's home. Her family, part of the city's respectable middle class, reported her missing. But in a city like Barcelona, children, especially in Raval, disappeared more often than anyone liked to admit. At first, the authorities moved slowly. The slums of Raval were no stranger to loss, and poor children vanished with disturbing regularity, usually without a trace or a follow-up. But Teresita's case was different. This wasn't a forgotten street orphan. Her disappearance lit a fire under the police, pushed by pressure from both the family and the press. Still, the investigation hit a wall. Days passed, no leads, until someone knocked on the police station door with a quiet but electrifying tip. Her name was Claudia Leyes, a neighbour from Ponant Street. She looked shaken. Claudia told Officer Rabot something that immediately changed the mood in the room. She had seen a blonde girl peeking out from behind the curtains of apartment number 29, Enriqueta Marti's apartment. The child, she said, looked directly at the street, and in her eyes, Claudia swore there was fear. It didn't make sense. Everyone knew Enriqueta Marti. She sold herbal remedies, sometimes whispered to be stronger than they should be. A former sex worker, yes, but a kidnapper? That wasn't something anyone had dared accuse her of, at least not out loud. Still, Ribot made a note of it, and over the next few days he watched. Enriqueta kept strange hours. She moved like a ghost, often slipping in and out of her building after midnight, always carrying soft, heavy bags. Never in a hurry, always alone. On February 27th, Officer Ribot and city official José Asens decided to act. They didn't storm the apartment with accusations. Instead, they knocked politely, pretending to be there about a different concern. Illegal poultry keeping, a mundane issue in the slums. The door creaked open. What hit them first was the smell, a thick, musty odour that made the back of the throat tighten. Inside, shadows clung to the walls, and in the gloom, huddled in a corner, was a little girl, pale, quiet, watching them. "What's your name?" Ribot asked gently. The child whispered, "Teresita." That should have been the end of it, but what followed shook Barcelona to its core. As they continued searching the apartment, the officers noticed something strange. A partition wall, thin, makeshift. They pushed through. On the other side was another girl. She was older, with sunken cheeks and dark smudges under her eyes. Her name was Angelita, and when asked about Enriqueta, she said something haunting. "Mama says not to talk about the stuff in the cloth bags." That one sentence flipped the investigation on its head. Ribot called for a full search of the apartment. What they found behind the walls, in cupboards and tucked away spaces, was beyond horrifying. Bundles of hair, small bone fragments wrapped in brittle newspaper, glass jars sealed tight with a dark, viscous liquid inside, substances no one could identify on sight, and tucked away a leather-bound notebook filled with scribbled recipes, odd symbols, and names. Dozens of them. Some names were familiar, others belonged to people far beyond the boundaries of Raval. Enriqueta was arrested that night. She denied everything, said she was a healer, that she helped women who had nowhere else to turn, that she used only herbs, never children, that the girls had been taken in, not taken. But her words couldn't erase the evidence. What was supposed to be a missing child case quickly escalated into something more. As public outrage surged, Barcelona's police widened the investigation. They began to retrace every step Enriqueta had taken over the years, searching every place she had lived, from the alleys of Raval to her childhood home in Sant Feliu de Llobregat. At one of her old apartments on Manubia Street, the nightmare deepened. Investigators found more jars, some filled with unidentifiable fluids, others containing pieces of children's clothing, some marked with dark stains. Back in Sant Feliu, they searched a locked storage area. Inside were cloth sacks. The contents? More fragments, some bones, some tissue. Investigators feared the worst. The material, they believed, belonged to children, victims. And yet, science in 1912 could only go so far. Forensics was rudimentary. Some bones were later identified as animal remains. Others were too damaged, too degraded to tell. The mysterious fluids weren't tested with any real method. No conclusive proof of murder, no definitive link to death, only suggestion, only whispers, only horror. With no bodies and no way to verify the most damning pieces of evidence, the authorities were left with the only thing they could truly prove: abduction. Enriqueta Marti was formally charged with kidnapping Teresita and Angelita. But everyone in Barcelona, every journalist, every mother, every officer, suspected more, so much more. By now, the name Enriqueta Marti had transformed into something else entirely. She wasn't just a woman, she was a shadow, a symbol. The vampire of Barcelona had been unmasked. She never made it to court. By the spring of 1913, Enriqueta Marti sat behind the walls of Reina Amalia prison, awaiting her reckoning. But the trial never came. On May 12th, her lifeless body was found sprawled inside her cell, bruised and beaten, her face swollen, her ribs fractured. The official report claimed it was inmate violence, that other women, horrified by the chilling stories that had filled the newspapers, had taken justice into their own hands. In a place like Raval, where every family knew someone who had lost a child, Enriqueta had become more than a suspect. She was the embodiment of every whispered fear, every mother's nightmare. And now, she was dead. But behind prison bars, where secrets rot slowly and stories are rarely simple, rumours began to crawl. Some believed her death wasn't just vengeance, it was silencing. That notebook found in her apartment, remember it? Pages filled with names, formulas and cryptic notes. Names that didn't belong in Raval, names that echoed through the salons of Barcelona's elite, businessmen, politicians, maybe even doctors, people with reputations to protect, people with power. No official investigation was ever opened, no thorough inquiry, no one asked who might have wanted her gone. The case was closed with a shrug. An altercation, the records claimed. But the silence? That was louder than any verdict. And so the story of Enriqueta Marti unravelled not in courtrooms, but in alleyways, kitchens and cafes, whispered like a bedtime horror story, passed down from generation to generation. The public moved on. The press turned to new scandals. The city exhaled and buried the truth under cobblestone and soot. But what was this really about? It was never just about one child, or even a dozen. This was a story about cracks in the foundations of a society. Cracks so deep they swallowed truth, guilt, and justice whole. Morally, this case asked something uncomfortable. What kind of city creates its own monsters? Yes, Enriqueta kidnapped Teresita Guitar, that much is clear. But what about everything else? The outlandish claims, the tales of human potions, the elite clientele, the dozens of missing children blamed solely on her shoulders? Could one woman really be the architect of all that horror? Or was she simply scapegoated, her image twisted and amplified, so the rest of the city wouldn't have to look too closely at itself? It's easier to condemn a lone woman than to confront a system, especially one that let children vanish without question. Socially, her case revealed a city split in two. On one side, Raval, where life was cheap and death cheaper, where kids disappeared without headlines. On the other side, the boulevards of the upper class, gleaming and indifferent. Enriqueta didn't come from wealth. She wasn't protected. She was born into poverty, shaped by neglect and ultimately abandoned. She didn't break the system. She was born from it. And when the city needed someone to carry its guilt, she was already wearing black. Psychologically, her story is unbearable. A mother who lost her baby to hunger, a woman who lived in society's blind spot. Maybe she did commit terrible acts. Maybe her grief mutated into something unrecognizable. Maybe she believed in some twisted way she was saving others by doing what she did. Or maybe she was just used, a vessel for fear, a mirror to everything people didn't want to see in themselves. That's what makes this case unforgettable. Not because of what Enriqueta did or didn't do, but because of what Barcelona did with her. She became a monster the city could point to, a convenient symbol of evil. And when she died, the city erased her. Clean, fast, no more questions. But monsters, real or invented, don't disappear that easily. They stay, in stories, in shadows, in the empty spaces between facts and fear. So now we ask you, what was more terrifying? Enriqueta Marti, the woman in black, or the city that let her walk its streets for over a decade, unseen? Was justice ever truly served? Drop your thoughts below. Let's talk. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't. See you in the next video.